Do you need a gimbal for your GoPro? That is the question we're going to explore today. Now, back before the GoPro Hero 7 was launched in September of 2018, the answer to that question was a resounding yes. Because before the GoPro Hero 7, the GoPro had no stabilization. GoPro did develop a solution for this at the time. GoPro had their own gimbal, and it was called the Karma Grip. Some of you may have used it before, some of you may remember it. The Karma Grip was compatible with all Hero Black cameras from the 5 all the way up to the 7. It cost $299 if you bought it standalone, and it also shipped with the Karma Drone kit. Rest in peace, Karma Drone. I used the Karma Grip on my Hero 5, 6, and 7 Black, and I loved it. It was a great tool, and it worked well most of the time. Unfortunately, GoPro has not created any gimbal for the Hero 8, 9, or 10 Black. With the advent of Hypersmooth and continuous improvement of Hypersmooth, you may wonder why would anybody need a gimbal, especially for the newest Hero 10, which features Hypersmooth 4.0. That's 4 generations of Hypersmooth. By now, there would be no need for a gimbal, right? GoPro even labeled some of their cameras as the gimbal killers. So why would anybody need a gimbal for a GoPro these days? I'm going to give you 5 reasons why you may want or need a gimbal. Now, don't get me wrong, Hypersmooth is great. It's come a long way. GoPro's done a great job with continuously improving that, and I do appreciate Hypersmooth. However, there are several use cases where Hypersmooth will degrade the quality of the GoPro footage, and the footage may actually be unusable when you're using Hypersmooth and not a gimbal. Let's talk about those 5 use cases where having a gimbal for the GoPro is important and essentially a must-have. Use case number 1, where you're going to want a gimbal. It's going to be when you're using ND filters on your GoPro. If you use ND filters on your GoPro, having a gimbal is a must-have. In case you don't know what ND filters are, ND stands for neutral density, and ND filters are essentially sunglasses for your GoPro. The ND filters allow you to use your GoPro on bright days outdoors in order to accomplish having the shutter speed set to double the frame rate. Now, why would you want the shutter speed set to double the frame rate? I'm glad you asked. Having the shutter speed set to double the frame rate is going to give you that smooth cinematic motion. There's going to be that proper level of motion blur when there's motion going on in your scene, and it's going to look extra good. There's nothing wrong with using auto shutter, but auto shutter in a lot of situations doesn't always look the best. It is easy to use auto shutter, and there's no problem with using it, but if you want that cinematic motion blur to take your footage to the next level, you're going to want to use ND filters. The reason you need a gimbal while shooting with ND filters is because you need to have Hypersmooth turned off. This is something that unfortunately I don't think gets talked about enough when ND filters are talked about. The companies that sell ND filters for the GoPro don't always mention this as well, and that's a shame because I believe a lot of people get ND filters for the GoPro and then they get really bad results and don't know why. But yes, when you're using ND filters, you need to have Hypersmooth turned off. Otherwise, your footage will look really bad and essentially be unusable. And the reason for this is Hypersmooth requires adequate lighting in order to stabilize properly. And when you put the ND filter on your GoPro, those sunglasses filter out too much of the light, even on a bright day. And when you do that, the footage is going to look really jittery and shaky. Here's an example here of what that looks like. Yeah, that looks really bad, doesn't it? I would not want that in my final product, and I don't think you would either. But obviously, if you turn Hypersmooth off, you're going to be left with unstabilized footage, and you don't want that either. So that's where a gimbal comes in. With this gimbal, you can turn Hypersmooth off, and you can still get adequate stabilization. The gimbal helps fill that gap. Use case number 2, where you'll probably want a gimbal for your GoPro, is low light shooting. Now, if you own a GoPro, you know that the GoPros are notoriously weak with low light shooting, and that's obviously because of the small sensor in the GoPro. That sensor being that tiny, it does have trouble picking up light in low lighting situations. But what a lot of people don't know is having Hypersmooth on when shooting in low light essentially is setting you up for failure. That footage will not look good, and most likely it will not be usable. When shooting in low light, you want to have Hypersmooth turned off. That will help ensure there is no jitteriness there. But again, like use case number 1, if you turn Hypersmooth off, the video is not going to be stabilized and it's going to look bad for that reason. So this is the second use case where having a gimbal is really important. With Hypersmooth turned off and your GoPro mounted on a gimbal, you're going to be able to get really good low light footage. And it's also going to allow you to use certain techniques that will make that footage extra good. Use case number 3, where you're probably going to want a gimbal, is if you're shooting indoors while moving with the GoPro. This is another use case where the GoPro is probably not going to get adequate light unless you're in a really well naturally lit indoor area, which most indoor areas are not. The windows are either too small or there's a lot of artificial lighting. And the reason you'll want a gimbal for the GoPro is the same as reason number 2 with low light. Indoor shooting is essentially the same as low light. It has to be really well lit for the GoPro and Hypersmooth to function properly. So when you're indoor shooting, you'll want to have Hypersmooth off. And of course, if you have it off, that non-stabilized footage is not going to look good, so you're going to want the gimbal with it. Use case number 4 that you would want a gimbal is a little bit different from the first 3, but is a very good reason to want a gimbal. So when you use Hypersmooth, something to keep in mind is Hypersmooth does crop that image. So instead of you getting the full 5.3K or 4K resolution, your image is going to be cropped by at least 10% when using Hypersmooth. And if you do boost mode, it's going to be cropped by even more. Therefore, your 5.3K or 4K image is essentially getting cropped in. In other words, Hypersmooth is basically guaranteeing you're getting less than that full quality resolution. So if you want to get the absolute best full quality image from your GoPro, you're going to want to have Hypersmooth turned off and you're going to want to have it mounted on a gimbal. And finally, use case number 5, where you may want or need a gimbal, is when you want a certain amount of motion in your footage. Now, what I mean by that is Hypersmooth has become so good that sometimes it's too good. And what I mean is that smoothness is so smooth that it starts to look unnatural. Sometimes you actually want a little bit of more movement to your stabilization. It'll actually look better, and your audience will feel more connected to the scene that you're filming. And depending on what you're doing with the GoPro, you may want a bit more motion to that. Hypersmooth is, well, really smooth. And of course, the same problem that I've mentioned before, if you turn Hypersmooth off to get more motion, you're going to get too much motion. Unstabilized footage from the GoPro is not good. So that's where you're going to want the gimbal. A gimbal will introduce more motion to the footage than Hypersmooth will. So it's not going to be as smooth as Hypersmooth, but it's going to be a lot more stable than having fully unstabilized footage. Now, I really like this about the gimbal in a lot of use cases. I like that little bit more motion to the stabilization. Hypersmooth is oftentimes too smooth. And really, it feels more natural and just simply looks better in a lot of situations. So now that we've established 5 use cases where you may want or need a gimbal for your GoPro, let's talk about that gimbal that I have found and used with my GoPros. So the gimbal that I have found to be the best with the GoPro, and that I'm going to talk about today, is the Inky Falcon. Now, I tested several different gimbals in order to arrive at this conclusion. There are some other good ones out there, but this one I felt is the best one for the price. The Inky Falcon retails for about $120 on Amazon, but I was able to get mine for $90. It often goes on sale. And a gimbal like this for less than $100, I consider a great deal. But even if I did pay $120, I would consider it a great deal after testing it out a good bit. It's definitely worth the $120. In fact, I was surprised by the quality of this from a brand that I had never heard of. I've never heard of Inky before, but I hope they keep up the good work and continue to develop this and continue to improve it and make it better and better. It's a great competitive product to see on the market. And something to note, this gimbal will also work with several other action camera brands. So inside the box here, let's take a look. Inside the box, you have a nice manual that comes with it. And then you have your main gimbal stabilizer here. You have an additional external tripod here that can screw onto it. You've got your Allen wrenches for adjusting it. And then you've got a charging cable. And you've got the screw right here to attach your GoPro or other action camera to the gimbal. So I'm going to take it out and I'm going to explain how to balance this and how to hook on the GoPro. And then I'm going to talk about some of the functions of it. And what I like about this for the GoPro, you can connect the GoPro wirelessly to this gimbal. And you can use a lot of these buttons on here to control the GoPro. So that's an added level of convenience. And the 10 does work with it. I've used the 10 with this quite a bit this last week and it works great. So let's get this out and set it up. So we're going to get out the tripod here, screw down the bottom. We'll fold out the legs so I can demonstrate here. All right, so this is what it looks like here, and it's pretty simple. It's got a couple axes where you can adjust the balance of this. So what you're going to have down here, you're going to have 2 screws here that you can adjust with the Allen wrench, and these slide up and down. I found that to balance my GoPro Hero 10, you need to have it about right here close to the middle. And I'll show you what balance looks like on here so that you'll know. And then the other one to adjust is going to be right here. And this one slides in and out like this. I'm going to hook on the Hero 10 here, and I'm going to show you what a balanced Hero 10 looks like. So the important thing when hooking it on, this text with the QR code here should face outward. We're going to get the camera on here, and we're going to screw it on. All right, once we have it attached and lined up, you're gonna know that it's balanced on here if you can basically move the camera in these directions and it doesn't roll back on its own. In other words, it stays exactly where you move it. It did take a little bit to balance it the first time, but since it just has 2 axes that you have to adjust, it's not too bad to balance it. I found it to take about 10 minutes my first time around as I was experimenting and fine-tuning. The one thing that's important to note is the camera does fit so closely here to this arm that unfortunately there's not room to put the media mod on it or to connect the USB-C cable for the microphone. So if you have the Hero 10 on this gimbal, unfortunately you will not be able to use an external mic with it. So that is something important to keep in mind. I find that the audio is good enough on the 10 if I want good audio from it, as long as it's not a windy day. If it's a windy day and I want the audio from this, I'm gonna have to come up with a different solution. I'm probably just gonna have to use the auto shutter or something like that, at least some of the time. But if I want those real cinematic shots, I will unplug my external mic or take off my media mod and pop it on here for that really good motion blur. So something else that's important to note is Inky has a pretty good app that goes with this stabilizer. And the name of that app is Falcon. So you can download it on iPhone or Android. So the important thing is to make sure you first of all connect your gimbal via Bluetooth. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to power it on, and then on my app here I'm going to click where it says not connected to gimbal, and I'm going to click connect. Once it's completed, I'm going to hit completed up here, and then I'm going to go down here to firmware update at the bottom, and I'm going to click check for updates. So right now there's no new version because I just updated to the latest one, and the latest firmware version you can check up here. It's firmware version 100. You'll definitely want to make sure it's on the latest firmware. The latest firmware is going to help ensure it's functioning properly and that any bug fixes are addressed on it. So when you look at working mode here, this is where you can adjust the modes if you want to. And the way to adjust them here is to click this M button, M for mode. So this is going to affect how it stabilizes. The PF is the mode that I'm going to use most often. And when you use the PF, basically the camera is going to go in the direction that you're going. So you go up, you go down, you go side to side. It's going to basically stay nice and smooth. And if you're following an object like this forwards, it's going to work well in that regard too. If you do the HL mode, HL is basically going to keep it locked into place. No matter what direction you point, it's not going to stay level. It's going to follow you. So it's going to look down at that angle. It's going to look up. If you go side to side, it's going to generally stay level, but if you tilt a little side to side, it's going to stay pointing down as well. So that mode can be useful in a lot of situations as well. If you do GL, that's basically going to stay locked on one point. So that's going to be when you really want it in some middle area here. The camera is basically not going to change its orientation from where you lock it. And then finally, they have an FPV mode. The FPV mode can be a lot of fun. That one is going to be if you want this to stay stabilized when you're doing some crazy stuff like this, if you're running through stuff. It's kind of cool. I tested it out the other day, running through some trees without running into trees. And it was pretty neat, so I appreciated that mode as well. And there are a couple other modes on here as well, such as the FL and the vertical mode. I don't find myself using those a lot, but with one of the modes, you can put your camera in portrait mode also. You also can adjust the motor response to slow, middle, and fast. I recommend experimenting with it to find what you like. In general, I keep it at middle. I find middle to be best. But if you have scenes where you want that motion to be a little slower when it's panning or faster, you can adjust it here. It's really easy. Same thing with the joystick speed. The joystick's right here on the gimbal. You can spin this 360 degrees and it'll just keep going and going. And then the joystick direction, you can make it forward or reverse as wanted. And the important thing, whatever mode you're in, if you want to return to that default configuration in that mode, just tap this twice, this trigger right here. So in this case, I'm in the PF mode, so it's going to return right here to that level anytime I tap that trigger. And then there are some calibration modes on here. So if you do the start static calibration, the camera's going to calibrate itself. You can also do an advanced configuration, which I did do when I first took it out of the box. I don't know if it was necessary because I don't feel like it made much of a difference. The camera already seemed to be good out of the box, but I did it anyway just as a precaution. And then down here at the controls, you can kind of customize what some of these buttons do. I stayed with the defaults. There's the default photo mode, there's the video mode, and then there's the time-lapse mode. And that's going to coincide with these buttons right here on the side. So the photo mode is at the top here, and the red record button here in the middle is for video, and then the bottom mode is time-lapse. These are going to coordinate to the modes on the GoPro. What I'm going to show you now is I'm going to show you how to connect your GoPro to this gimbal. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to power on the GoPro, and we're going to swipe down here. We're going to swipe left, we're going to click on connections, we're going to click on wireless connection to first of all make sure that wireless is turned on. And if wireless is on, we're then going to go down here to connect device. We're going to tap on GoPro Quick App. If the connection doesn't succeed at first, I did some reading on this, and if you tap this button quickly 8 times, the power button back here, it puts it into some type of standby mode, and usually the connection will happen right after that. So now that we've got it connected, we can toggle between modes here. And if I click on the photo, it's going to take a picture. If I click down here, it's going to start recording video. And if I click down here at the bottom, it's going to start doing a time lapse. It's really convenient to have these buttons that can be mapped to the GoPro. It makes it really easy and simple to use the GoPro with this. And the other nice thing is when you click here to power off, it'll power off the gimbal and the GoPro. So that's really nice. And then when you power it on, it's going to power on the gimbal and it's going to power on the GoPro. So all in all, really neat to have it connected like that. The other nice thing is when you need to charge it, there's a port right here on the opposite side of the control buttons. It's USB-C. And then the USB cable right here, you can plug into a computer or you can plug into a wall outlet with USB. Inky does recommend giving it a full charge when you first take it out of the box for maximum battery life. And once it's fully charged, this gimbal will last up to 9 hours. That's a good charge. I found that it lasted at least 9 hours with all my testing. I had no worries about it running out on me. So what I would like to show you now is I'd like to show you a little bit of the sample footage that I got using the Inky Falcon, so you can have a good gauge on how well it stabilizes, what type of stabilization it provides, and just so you can see how it works. Let's take a look at that footage. So what did you think? Obviously not as smooth as Hypersmooth, but at the same time, much smoother than non-stabilized footage. I think this gimbal provides a good happy medium. I like that little bit of motion to my stabilization where it's not perfectly smooth. It feels a lot more immersive. Being able to get that really good quality motion blur makes this gimbal a must-have for me. So far, I've had 0 problems with this as well. It is one of the higher rated gimbals based on customer reviews. The Inky Falcon is not perfect, but it's almost perfect. For the price of $120 or less when it's on sale, I consider it a great deal for a gimbal for the GoPro, especially if you do any of those 5 use cases that I talk about. So Inky, I've never heard of you before, but you created a great product. Keep up the good work, and I hope to see you continuously improve and innovate with this gimbal. If you found this video to be helpful, please please slam that like button. And if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please hit subscribe and the bell notification so you'll be notified every time I publish a new video. Until we talk again, happy gimbaling with the GoPro.